You are most dangerous when your ignorance sounds like certainty. You have probably met someone like this before, maybe in a meeting, maybe at a family table, maybe online. Someone speaks with complete certainty about something they barely understand. They do not hesitate. They do not question themselves. They do not leave room for nuance. And what makes it even more unsettling is this: the deeper their mistake, the stronger their confidence seems to become. That is the doorway into this book. Why do people with less ability in a certain area so often believe they are above average? Why do some people get things so wrong, yet speak as if they stand on unshakable ground? And the most uncomfortable question of all is not about them. It is about you. Because this pattern is not reserved for foolish strangers. It can live inside any mind, including yours, in the very place where you feel most certain. To understand that, we begin with a story that sounds absurd, almost comic, until you realize how human it really is. In 1995, MacArthur Wheeler robbed a bank in broad daylight without hiding his face because he believed lemon juice would make him invisible to security cameras. He was not joking. He was not performing. He truly believed he had found a clever solution. Later, that bizarre confidence helped inspire the research now widely known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, the idea that people with low ability in a specific area often overestimate their competence. The MacArthur Wheeler story and the explanation of the Dunning-Kruger effect are based on the Encyclopedia Britannica entry, Dunning-Kruger effect. This story matters because it gives you more than a strange criminal anecdote. It gives you a mirror. Wheeler did not fail only because he lacked knowledge. He failed because he lacked the ability to recognize that his knowledge was broken. That is the deeper danger we will follow through this entire journey. Not simple ignorance, not innocence, but the blindness that says, "I already understand," when in truth, the ground beneath that confidence is empty. And once you see that pattern, you begin to notice it everywhere. In conversations, in careers, in public life, in private decisions, in the silent stories people tell themselves to avoid the pain of not knowing. This book is not here to mock them. It is here to help you see how overconfidence is born, why it survives, and how you can protect your own mind from becoming trapped inside it. Chapter 1. The First Illusion. When shallow knowledge feels like strong confidence, you may have noticed something strange about confidence. It does not always belong to the most capable person in the room. Sometimes it belongs to the person who has only touched the surface. That is where this chapter begins. Not with intelligence, but with the illusion of intelligence. Not with mastery, but with the feeling of mastery that appears too early, when you have not yet seen the true depth of a subject. Your mind often makes a silent mistake. It assumes the subject is simple. And once something looks simple, you naturally feel as if you already understand it. That feeling can be comforting. It can even feel empowering. But comfort is not proof. Certainty is not proof. A calm voice is not proof. Very often, the first wave of confidence appears before real understanding has even begun. Think about a person who watches a few videos about investing and suddenly starts talking as if markets are easy to read. They begin using bold language. They speak about trends, timing, winners, and losers with the tone of someone who has cracked the code. Or think about a person who reads a few popular articles on psychology and starts believing they can read anyone in front of them. They feel they can identify motives, wounds, habits, and hidden patterns in every conversation. These people are not always arrogant. They are not always trying to deceive others. In many cases, they are simply being deceived by the surface. The surface is persuasive because it gives you just enough shape to feel familiar, but not enough depth to feel small. And that is the danger. Real depth humbles you. Real depth shows you how much more there is to see. But shallow contact often does the opposite. It gives you a quick burst of confidence before reality has had time to correct you. You see this everywhere in ordinary life. A person reads one article about nutrition and now feels qualified to judge everybody's body and diet. A person listens to a short podcast about leadership and suddenly believes they understand what it takes to guide people through uncertainty. A person watches a documentary about history and now speaks as if a whole civilization can be explained in one neat sentence. What is happening in these moments is not wisdom, it is premature closure. The mind hates open loops. It loves the relief of saying, "Now I get it." And when you do not yet know enough to see complexity, that relief comes far too soon. This is why early confidence can feel so convincing. It is not built on malice. It is built on missing layers. The person feels certain because they do not yet know what would make certainty impossible. They have not met the contradictions, the exceptions, the hard questions, the hidden variables, the painful details that would force them to slow down. They are standing at the entrance and calling it the whole building. You may have done this yourself. Most people have. You learn a little, and for a moment, that little feels like a lot. Then, if you keep going, something changes. You begin to see how much you missed. You notice how fragile your first conclusions were. You become less dramatic, less absolute, less eager to sound final. That is not weakness, that is growth. Because one of the clearest signs of maturity is this: you stop using confidence as proof that you understand. By the end of this chapter, I want you to carry one quiet truth with you. Confidence is not always the child of skill. Many times, it is the child of a narrow view. And once you understand that, you become more careful with your own certainty. You begin to ask a better question. Not, how sure do I feel? But, how deeply have I really seen? Chapter 2. The Trap of Knowing the Name, but Not the Nature. There is a subtle mistake your mind can make. And it is one of the easiest mistakes to live with because it feels so intelligent while it is happening. You hear a powerful term. You remember a sharp quote. You repeat an idea that sounds wise. And little by little, you begin to feel as though you truly understand the thing itself. But familiarity is not the same as understanding. Recognition is not the same as depth. And being able to say the right words is not the same as being able to carry the weight of what those words mean. This is where many people get trapped. They learn the language of a subject before they learn the substance of it. They pick up the surface signals of intelligence and mistake those signals for real comprehension. You can see this everywhere. Someone memorizes a few lines about discipline, healing, trauma, dopamine, habits, or self-control, and suddenly they begin speaking with the tone of an authority. They sound polished. They sound current. They sound informed. But the moment the conversation goes one layer deeper, something starts to break. Their explanation becomes vague. Their certainty becomes repetitive. Their clarity disappears. They know the label, but they do not know the living reality behind the label. And that difference matters more than most people realize. Because true understanding changes the way you see connections. It changes the questions you ask. It changes how carefully you speak. A person who truly understands an idea can explain it in simple language. They can apply it in a new situation. They can describe where it works, where it fails, and where it becomes dangerous if misused. But a person who only knows the name often depends on borrowed phrases. They keep circling the same polished lines because the polished lines are all they have. This is why some conversations collapse the moment you ask a sincere follow-up question. Not an aggressive question, just a deeper one. What exactly do you mean by that? How does that work in real life? What is the difference between this and something that looks similar? What are the limits of that idea? Suddenly, the person who sounded so certain begins to stall. Their confidence was not built on understanding. It was built on recognition. And recognition is a very weak foundation when real thinking begins. You have probably felt this in yourself too. Maybe you once heard a concept so often that it started to feel like your own wisdom. Maybe you repeated it because it helped you make sense of something in your life. That does not make you foolish. It makes you human. The mind loves familiar language because familiar language gives you a sense of control. It lets you feel close to mastery without paying the full price of learning. But growth begins when you become honest about that difference. When you can say, "I know this phrase, but I do not yet know this truth deeply enough." That sentence is not a defeat. It is the beginning of real understanding. Many people never reach that point because sounding informed is easier than becoming informed. Repeating is easier than wrestling. Naming is easier than seeing. But if you want a wiser life, you have to choose depth over display. You have to resist the temptation to treat borrowed insight as earned understanding. The warning sign in this chapter is simple and powerful. If you cannot explain an idea clearly in your own words, if you cannot carry it into a real situation, if you cannot answer one honest question beyond the slogan, then you may not truly understand what you have been saying. And that realization, though humbling, is a gift. Because the moment you stop mistaking familiarity for wisdom is the moment you become teachable again. And the teachable mind is always stronger than the performative one. Chapter 3. The mind hates empty spaces, so it invents understanding. Your mind does not like unfinished pictures. It does not like loose ends, open questions, or long periods of uncertainty. It wants a clean story, a clear reason, a quick conclusion. That desire is deeply human. It can even feel efficient, but it is also one of the reasons people become confidently wrong. When the facts are incomplete, most people do not stop and say, "I do not know yet." They rush to fill the gap. They build an explanation that sounds reasonable, and then they begin to treat that explanation as if it were the truth itself. This is one of the quiet ways false confidence is born. Not always through pride, not always through vanity. Sometimes it begins with discomfort. The discomfort of not knowing, the discomfort of ambiguity, the discomfort of having to wait before forming a judgment. And because that discomfort feels so unpleasant, the mind reaches for relief. It grabs the first story that seems to make sense and settles into it too quickly. You can see this happen every day. Someone hears a short piece of political news and suddenly feels they understand the entire system of power behind it. A single headline becomes a complete worldview. One public statement becomes proof of hidden motives. A brief clip becomes enough to judge who is corrupt, who is wise, who is dangerous, and who is innocent. The missing details do not slow them down. In many cases, the missing details make them even bolder, because the mind has more room to project its own assumptions into the empty spaces. The same thing happens when people watch a conflict unfold online. They see a few seconds of footage, one emotional reaction, one side of a story. And within moments they believe they understand the morality, intention, and character of everyone involved. They do not only form an opinion, they form a complete explanation. They decide who is right, who is cruel, who is manipulative, who is weak, who is guilty, and why everything happened the way it did. But what they often trust is not reality. What they trust is a story their mind created to escape uncertainty. That is the deeper danger. Error does not come only from missing information. Error also comes from the emotional need to answer too soon. Your brain would often rather have a neat fiction than an honest blank space. It prefers a complete illusion over an incomplete truth. And if you are not careful, that preference can begin to guide your entire way of thinking. You stop investigating. You stop listening. You stop asking what else could be true. Once the mind feels the relief of a closed story, it tends to defend that story, even when new details begin to challenge it. This is why people can be so certain while standing on such thin ground. They are not resting on evidence. They are resting on emotional closure. The story feels complete, so they mistake that feeling for accuracy. But wisdom begins in a very different place. Wisdom is willing to leave space open. Wisdom can say, there are missing pieces here. Wisdom can tolerate the tension of not knowing yet. That sounds small, but it is a profound kind of strength. Because the person who can remain calm in uncertainty is much less likely to become a prisoner of a false explanation. So, as you move through your own life, pay attention to the moments when you rush to complete the picture. Pay attention to the speed of your certainty. Sometimes what feels like clarity is only impatience wearing the mask of intelligence. And once you see that, a new kind of freedom begins. You no longer need to fill every silence with a conclusion. You no longer need to turn every fragment into a full story. You begin to understand that not knowing is not weakness. Very often, it is the most honest position you can take. And that honesty protects you from the kind of confidence that sounds strong but is built on air. Chapter 4. Not skilled enough to recognize who is truly skilled. One of the hardest truths to accept is this. In order to recognize real excellence, you need at least some degree of ability yourself. If your understanding is too weak, you may not be able to tell the difference between deep competence and polished performance. You may think you are admiring greatness when in fact you are only reacting to confidence, style, or noise. This is why people who are weak in a field often place their trust in the wrong voices. They do not mean to. They are simply missing the tools required to judge well. In music, a person without a trained ear may hear two performers and think both sound equally good. They may notice the melody, the feeling, the general impression, but they cannot hear the subtle control, timing, restraint, and mastery that set one artist apart from another. In thought, the same thing happens. A person without a strong foundation may hear someone speak boldly and assume that boldness is depth. They may hear quick answers, sharp phrases, and a forceful tone, then mistake those things for wisdom. But speaking with certainty is not the same as seeing clearly. A loud mind is not always a deep mind. This is where many people get lost. When you lack skill, you often judge by surface signals. You look for what is easy to detect. Confidence, speed, charisma, complexity, strong opinions, memorable lines. But real excellence is not always flashy. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is careful. Sometimes it speaks with restraint because it sees too many layers to pretend that simple answers are enough. And that kind of excellence is very easy to overlook if you have not yet developed the eyes or ears to recognize it. This explains something painful about the world. Society often rewards what is easiest to notice, not what is deepest in substance. The person who speaks with force may be celebrated over the person who thinks with care. The person who dominates attention may be followed over the person who deserves trust. The result is that many people end up learning from those who impress them rather than those who can truly guide them. And once that happens, the damage multiplies. You not only misunderstand a subject, you also choose the wrong model for how understanding should look. That is how confusion spreads. You can see this in everyday life. A person listens to two speakers. One offers simple, absolute answers and sounds unstoppable. The other speaks with precision, caution, and nuance. The first feels stronger. The second may sound less exciting, but the first may be shallow, while the second is grounded in reality. If you do not yet know enough, you may choose the wrong one with complete sincerity. And that distinction matters, because training can change the way you see. The more you grow in a field, the more sensitive you become to what once escaped you. You begin to hear the difference between style and substance. You begin to notice when someone is simplifying too much. You begin to value calm accuracy over dramatic certainty. That is the beginning of mature judgment. So, this chapter leaves you with an important realization. If you cannot yet recognize real depth, be careful whom you admire. Be careful whom you follow. Be careful whom you let shape your mind, because when your standards are still immature, you are vulnerable to appearances. And once you understand that, you also begin to understand why the world so often rewards noise over depth. Not because depth has no value, but because depth requires developed perception. And where perception is weak, performance usually wins. Chapter 5. The less self-awareness you have, the harder it is to detect your own mistakes. There is a form of ability that almost nobody talks about when they speak of intelligence, yet it quietly shapes everything. It is the ability to see your own errors, not the dramatic errors that everybody can notice after the damage is done, not the obvious mistakes that become clear in hindsight. I mean the subtle flaws in your thinking, your speaking, your judgment, your work, your decisions, and your self-image while they are still happening. This ability is rare because it asks something difficult from you. It asks you to stand inside your own mind and still question what feels natural there. It asks you to look at your own performance without automatically becoming your own defender. And most of all, it asks you to know enough about what is right that you can recognize where you are wrong. That is the part many people miss. To know whether you are doing badly, you need some real sense of what good actually looks like. Without that standard, self-evaluation becomes dangerously unreliable. You may feel clear when you are vague. You may feel persuasive when you are confusing. You may feel strong when you are simply rigid. This is why people can be so wrong about themselves without ever noticing. They are not always lying. Often they are grading themselves with a scale they do not understand. Think about an inexperienced writer reading their own work. The sentences make sense to them because they already know what they meant. The ideas feel connected because the missing links are filled in by their own mind. So, they finish the piece and believe it is clear, but another reader enters that same page and feels lost, because what seemed obvious in the writer's head was never fully expressed on the page. Or think about a weak speaker who walks away from a conversation feeling powerful and convincing. In their own ears, they sounded firm. In their own memory, they made strong points. But the people listening may have heard something very different. Repetition instead of clarity. Volume instead of precision. Confidence instead of logic. Or picture a poor leader who believes they are decisive. They think they are inspiring certainty. In truth, they may be shutting down discussion, confusing fear with respect, and mistaking control for leadership. In each case, the same problem is alive. The person cannot see the flaw because the standard itself is blurry. And without a reliable standard, self-judgment becomes an easy place for pleasant illusions to grow. This is why you should be careful whenever you feel tempted to trust your self-rating too quickly. Your own mind is not a neutral judge. It is often tired, protective, emotional, and eager to preserve a good image of who you are. It wants coherence more than accuracy. And if you do not deliberately train yourself to compare your work, your thinking, and your behavior against something more solid, that is a dangerous place to live. Because once you believe your self-assessment without question, growth begins to slow down. You stop looking for blind spots. You stop inviting correction. You stop noticing the gap between intention and effect. This chapter is meant to leave you with a difficult but freeing truth. You do not automatically earn the right to trust the way you score yourself. That trust must be built. It must be tested. It must be refined through feedback, reflection, humility, and contact with standards higher than your comfort. That truth may sting a little, but inside that sting is something clean and powerful. The moment you admit that your view of yourself may be incomplete is the moment you become capable of real improvement. And that kind of honesty is not weakness. It is one of the strongest forms of intelligence you can develop. Chapter 6. The ego would rather be protected than corrected. Many arguments are not really about truth. On the surface, they look like debates about ideas, facts, or principles. But underneath, something more emotional is often happening. A person is not defending a thought. They are defending an identity. They are protecting the image they have built of themselves, and once that image feels threatened, the conversation stops being a search for what is right. It becomes a struggle to survive embarrassment, insecurity, and inner collapse. This is why so many people cannot receive correction calmly. The issue is not always the evidence. The issue is what the evidence touches inside them. When a belief becomes tied to self-worth, any challenge to that belief feels personal. It no longer sounds like information. It sounds like disrespect. It sounds like humiliation. It sounds like a threat to status. And once the ego interprets feedback as an attack, reason begins to lose its power. The person is no longer listening in order to understand. They are listening in order to defend. They are searching for a way to escape the feeling of being exposed. You can feel this shift in real conversations. Someone is shown that they are mistaken, and instead of becoming more thoughtful, they become louder. Instead of becoming curious, they become sharper. Instead of slowing down, they rush into stronger claims. The new evidence does not soften them. It hardens them. They cling more tightly to the belief they had a moment ago, not because that belief has grown stronger, but because their ego has grown more frightened. What you are witnessing in that moment is not intellectual strength. It is inner panic trying to look powerful. The person may raise their voice, repeat the same point, mock the other side, or dismiss clear facts without really examining them. From the outside, it can look stubborn or irrational, but underneath it is often something more fragile. A desperate need not to feel small. A desperate need not to be seen as the kind of person who could be wrong. And because that need is emotional, logic alone usually cannot reach it. This is why so many arguments feel impossible to win through reason. The real battle is happening below the level of logic. It is happening inside pride, inside shame, inside the fear of losing face. Once you understand that, many painful interactions begin to make more sense. You stop being surprised by the fact that evidence fails. Evidence fails because the other person is not only protecting an idea, They are protecting a self-image that they do not know how to live without. This does not excuse harmful behavior, but it does help you see it more clearly. And that clarity matters, because it also teaches you something about yourself. You are vulnerable to the same pattern. Any belief that becomes part of your identity can become difficult to examine honestly. Any opinion that makes you feel special, superior, wise, or safe can turn into an emotional shelter. And once that happens, correction begins to feel like injury. That is why maturity requires more than intelligence. It requires enough inner stability to let your ideas be questioned without feeling that your entire worth is under attack. The goal is not to become passive or unsure of everything. The goal is to build a self that does not need every belief to be a fortress. A calm mind can revise itself. A secure person can say, "I may have been wrong," without falling apart. And that kind of strength is rare. This chapter leaves you with a hard but freeing insight. Many conflicts cannot be solved by better arguments alone, because the deeper conflict is not between two ideas. It is between truth and vanity, between correction and pride, between clarity and the desperate need to protect the self. Once you see that, you begin to understand why reasoning often fails where wounded ego is in command. And you also begin to see the kind of inner work required if you want to become someone who values truth more than self-defense. Chapter 7. When the wrong applause feeds confident ignorance. You can be wrong on your own, but when a crowd agrees with you, that wrongness can begin to feel like identity. That is one of the most dangerous things an environment can do to a human mind. It can turn error into belonging. It can turn confusion into confidence. It can make a person feel sharp, insightful, and exceptional. Not because they have grown in wisdom, but because they have been surrounded by the wrong kind of applause. This matters more than most people realize, because people do not build their self-image in isolation. You learn who you think you are, partly through reflection, through reactions, through what gets rewarded around you, through what gets celebrated, repeated, and approved. If the room claps at the wrong moment, you may begin to trust a false version of yourself. If the people around you praise what is shallow, extreme, careless, or flashy, then over time you may start to believe those qualities are signs of strength. And the less you are challenged, the more convincing that illusion becomes. This is how confident ignorance grows beyond the individual. Imagine a group of friends who constantly validate one another, not with honesty, but with easy admiration. Nobody questions the weak idea. Nobody slows down the reckless conclusion. Nobody says, "That does not make sense," or "You may be missing something important." Instead, every opinion gets treated like brilliance. Every emotional reaction gets framed as deep insight. Every strong statement gets rewarded as courage. In that kind of group, people do not become wiser. They become louder versions of their blind spots. The same thing happens in online communities. A person shares only the opinions that already fit the mood of the crowd. The crowd responds with approval. Agreement becomes instant. Nuance disappears. Contradiction is punished. Slowly, a person stops asking whether something is true and starts asking whether it will be applauded. And once applause replaces truth as the standard, the mind becomes easier to corrupt. You no longer need evidence, you only need resonance. You only need the comfort of hearing your thoughts echoed back to you by people who want the same emotional reward. There is another version of this in workplaces. In some places, people are too afraid to speak honestly to a leader. They nod, they flatter, they soften reality. They hide concerns. They tell the person at the top what feels safe rather than what is true. Over time, that leader may begin to believe they are wise, decisive, and impressive. But what they are really seeing is a distorted mirror. The silence around them is not proof of excellence. The praise around them is not proof of sound judgment. It may simply be proof that nobody feels safe enough to tell the truth. This is why environment matters so deeply. A warped environment can train a person to trust the wrong signals. It can make fake feedback feel like real evidence. It can convince people that they are growing when they are only being protected from correction. And once that pattern settles in, ignorance becomes harder to remove, because it is no longer just a personal weakness. It is being reinforced from the outside. It is being fed. It is being rewarded. That should make you more compassionate, but also more alert. Because if you want to think clearly, you must pay attention not only to your own mind, but also to the rooms that shape it. Ask yourself what gets rewarded around you. Ask yourself whether the people close to you tell you the truth or simply preserve your comfort. Ask yourself whether your environment sharpens you or flatters you. This chapter leaves you with a sobering truth. Ignorance is not always born inside one person alone. Sometimes it is cultivated by the group, protected by the culture, and strengthened by the fear of honest feedback. And once you see that, you understand why some of the most confident minds are not the clearest ones. They are simply standing in front of mirrors that never tell the truth. Chapter 8. Complex language often hides simple thinking. One of the easiest ways to appear intelligent is to sound difficult. Big terms, long sentences, abstract phrases, a confident tone, vague concepts wrapped in polished language. All of this can create the appearance of depth. But appearance is not depth, and many people who lack real substance become very skilled at creating the feeling of substance in other people. That is why language can be so deceptive. Not because words are evil, but because words can be arranged in ways that impress before they clarify. And if you are not careful, you may start mistaking complexity of expression for complexity of thought. You may hear something dense and assume it must be profound. You may read something elegant and assume it must be true. But the sound of intelligence is not the same as the presence of intelligence. A person can speak in a way that feels sophisticated while saying almost nothing of value. In fact, some of the weakest thinkers depend on this strategy without even realizing it. They use language not to make reality clearer, but to protect themselves from being seen clearly. They hide behind fog. They replace direct meaning with ornate performance. They hope that if the words feel elevated enough, nobody will stop long enough to ask what is actually being said. You can recognize this pattern in many places. A speaker talks for a long time, using forceful delivery and polished vocabulary. Yet when the talk ends, you struggle to summarize the main point in one plain sentence. The listener feels impressed, but not illuminated. Or you read a piece of writing that sounds refined, intelligent, even grand. But when you strip away the elegant phrasing, what remains is surprisingly ordinary. A few familiar ideas, a few recycled observations. Nothing wrong with simple ideas, of course. The problem is the disguise. The performance creates an illusion of depth that the content itself cannot carry. This happens because many people are drawn to what they do not fully understand. Difficulty can create prestige. Obscurity can feel intellectual. And for someone who wants to be admired, that is very useful. If others cannot easily challenge what you say, they may assume the problem is their own limitation, not your lack of clarity. So, the speaker gains power through confusion. The writer gains authority through fog. The performance works not because it is wise, but because it creates distance between the audience and the truth. But genuine understanding tends to move in the opposite direction. A person who truly sees something clearly can usually express it clearly. Not always in the shortest way, not always in the simplest way, but in a way that brings light rather than smoke. Real depth does not panic when asked to become plain. Real thought can survive translation into ordinary language. It does not need constant decoration to stay alive. This gives you a simple test, and it is one of the most useful tests in this entire book. If an idea is truly understood, it should be possible to explain it in clear words. If a person cannot do that, if they only replace one cloud of jargon with another cloud of jargon, perhaps they do not understand what they are saying as deeply as they want you to believe. Perhaps complexity is doing the work that clarity cannot do. That does not mean every difficult idea is false. Some truths are difficult because reality is difficult. But even then, true understanding aims toward illumination, not concealment. It seeks to make the hard thing more graspable, not more impressive. So, as you listen, read, and think, do not ask only whether something sounds intelligent. Ask whether it becomes clearer as it unfolds. Ask whether it can be carried into plain speech without collapsing. Ask whether the language serves understanding or merely decorates confusion. This chapter leaves you with a powerful kind of protection. Once you stop worshipping complexity for its own sake, you become much harder to fool. You begin to value clarity as a sign of strength, not simplicity as a sign of weakness. And in that shift, your mind becomes calmer, sharper, and less vulnerable to people who want to seem deep rather than become deep. Chapter 9. Early small success can create a dangerous illusion of greatness. Failure is not the only thing that misleads you. Sometimes success is far more dangerous, especially when it arrives too early. A few good results at the beginning can quietly persuade you that you already belong at a very high level. That is how illusion grows in a flattering form. You do something once or twice, it goes well, and your mind begins to build a story around those moments. It does not simply say, "That went well." It says, "This proves who I am." And that leap from result to identity is where many people begin to lose contact with reality. Early success can come from many places. It may come from luck. It may come from favorable timing. It may come from being judged by a low standard. It may come from entering a field where the competition around you is weak. It may come from natural ease in one small area that does not yet represent full ability. None of these things make the success false. The result may be real. The praise may be sincere. The outcome may be deserved within that moment. But the interpretation can still be badly distorted. That is the part you must learn to watch. A person makes a few profitable investment decisions and begins to believe they understand the market. They mistake a brief run of favorable outcomes for deep skill. Another person starts a new job and receives praise in the first weeks. They are encouraged, and that encouragement is not wrong. But then something shifts. They no longer treat praise as a good beginning. They treat it as proof that they have already risen above the ordinary level. Or consider a person who happens to say a few accurate things about people, timing, or future events. They begin to imagine they possess unusual instinct, rare insight, almost a special gift. In each case, the original success is not the problem. The problem is what the ego builds on top of it. Small wins can become seeds of large delusions when they are interpreted without enough patience. This happens because the mind loves clean narratives about the self. If something goes well, it wants to turn that moment into a declaration. It wants to say, "Now I know what I am. Now I know how gifted I am. Now I know I belong among the exceptional. But real ability is rarely established that quickly. Real competence has to survive changing conditions, pressure, setbacks, boredom, complexity, and time. It has to prove itself beyond the first favorable moment. Without that testing, what feels like confidence may be only a premature conclusion built on a small sample of events. This is why early success can sometimes be more dangerous than early failure. Failure tends to humble you. It slows you down. It forces you to question your method, your assumptions, your readiness. But early success can make you sleep deeply inside a flattering illusion. It can remove the urgency to keep learning. It can make you less teachable. It can make you confuse momentum with mastery. And once that confusion settles in, growth becomes much harder because the person no longer feels like a beginner. They feel established long before they are formed. There is nothing wrong with enjoying success. There is nothing wrong with feeling encouraged by a good result. In fact, encouragement matters. It gives energy. It gives hope. It helps you continue. But wise people know how to receive success without worshipping it. They know how to say, "This went well, but I still need more evidence before I build a grand story about myself." They know how to stay grounded while still being grateful. That balance is rare, and it protects you from one of the most seductive traps in life. So this chapter leaves you with a caution that may save you years of confusion. Do not judge your true level too quickly by your first victories. Sometimes your earliest success is not a crown. Sometimes it is a test. It asks whether you will stay open, disciplined, and honest, or whether you will turn a small beginning into a large illusion. And those who fail that test often do not fall because they were defeated. They fall because they believed too soon that they had already arrived. Chapter 10. Truly wise people speak more carefully because they see more layers. There is a common misunderstanding in the world. Many people assume that the strongest mind is the one that speaks fastest, answers most directly, and sounds the most certain. But real maturity often looks very different. Sometimes the wiser person is slower to make a final claim. Sometimes the deeper mind leaves more room in its language. Sometimes the person who truly understands says less than the person who only thinks they do. That is not weakness. It is not confusion. It is often the clearest sign of a grown mind. The deeper you understand something, the more layers you begin to see. You notice more variables. You notice more exceptions. You notice the hidden conditions that shape outcomes. You notice how one truth changes when context changes. You notice how the same principle can help in one situation and harm in another. As your vision becomes wider, your speech becomes more careful. You stop talking as if one sentence can hold the whole of reality. You become more precise, not because you know less, but because you know enough to respect complexity. This is why truly wise people often sound less dramatic than shallow ones. The shallow mind says, "That is definitely how it is." The deeper mind says, "In many cases that is true, but it depends on the circumstances." One statement sounds sharper. The other is usually closer to reality. And because reality is often less neat than people want, mature thinking rarely feels as exciting as overconfidence. It does not always satisfy the emotional hunger for certainty, but it is far more trustworthy. You can see this in almost every area of life. A person with a shallow understanding of human behavior may speak in rigid labels. They decide quickly who someone is, what they meant, what they will always do. A person with more depth becomes slower to reduce people into simple categories. They still make judgments, but their judgments breathe. They leave room for contradiction, growth, pain, history, and hidden factors. Or take success. The shallow mind loves formulas. It wants to say that one behavior always leads to one outcome. The mature mind sees that effort matters, but so do timing, opportunity, relationships, health, and forces outside your control. That does not make the mature mind passive. It makes it honest. Careful speech is not a sign that someone lacks conviction. It is often a sign that their conviction has been refined by contact with reality. They have been corrected enough times to stop pretending that simple claims are always enough. They have seen enough failure, complexity, and exception to know that absolute language can become a trap, so they speak with steadiness rather than theatrical certainty. They are not trying to sound impressive. They are trying to remain true. This matters because many people mistake intellectual humility for weakness. They hear a cautious voice and assume it lacks power. They hear a nuanced answer and assume it lacks courage. But in truth, it takes much more strength to resist false certainty than to perform confidence for approval. It takes maturity to say, "There are many factors here." It takes inner security to admit, "This is what I see, but I may still be missing something." And that kind of humility is not the enemy of intelligence. It is one of its highest forms. As you grow, you may notice this change in yourself. You may become less eager to make sweeping statements. You may become more patient before drawing conclusions. You may begin to choose words that leave room for reality, instead of forcing reality to fit your first impression. If that happens, do not mistake it for hesitation in the weak sense. It may be a sign that your mind is becoming more mature. This chapter leaves you with a quiet but powerful redefinition. Caution is not always fear. Restraint is not always insecurity. Very often, the wisest people speak more carefully because they can see what others still cannot. They see more layers, more conditions, more complexity, and more truth. And once you learn to value that kind of carefulness, you stop admiring certainty for its own sake. You begin to recognize intellectual humility as a mark of depth, stability, and genuine strength. Chapter 11. The only way out of confident foolishness is to learn the right kind of doubt. This book cannot end by exposing other people. That would be too easy. It would let you listen from a distance, nod at the flaws of strangers, and walk away untouched. But the real purpose of this journey is not to help you identify foolishness in others. It is to help you catch it in yourself before it hardens into character, because no one is immune to self-illusion. No one is naturally safe from the temptation to overestimate their clarity, their judgment, or their depth. The danger is not reserved for loud people, arrogant people, or careless people. It belongs to every human mind that becomes too comfortable with its own conclusions. That is why the only real protection is not shame, not self-hatred, and not constant insecurity. The only real protection is self-examination. You do not need to become a person who doubts your worth. You need to become a person who examines your certainty. There is a very important difference between those two things. One destroys you. The other matures you. Healthy doubt does not whisper that you are useless. It asks whether you may be incomplete. It asks whether your confidence has outrun your evidence. It asks whether there is a missing piece you have not yet seen. That kind of questioning does not weaken your mind. It cleans it. It keeps your thoughts from hardening too early. It stops you from turning comfort into truth. If you want to stay awake, you have to build this habit deliberately. You have to ask yourself simple but demanding questions on a regular basis. What might I be missing here? Who understands this better than I do? What kind of evidence would show that I am wrong? These questions sound small, but they can save you from years of false certainty. They interrupt the smooth voice of the ego. They reopen the doors that pride tries to shut. And most importantly, they keep you teachable. You can see this change in ordinary behavior. A person is challenged, and instead of reacting instantly, they pause for one breath. That pause may look insignificant from the outside, but inwardly it is enormous. It creates space between injury and response. It gives truth one more chance to enter before pride takes control. Another person, before making a strong claim, tries to explain the idea in plain language. If they cannot explain it clearly, they take that as a warning sign, not a humiliation, a signal. Another person actively seeks out someone more skilled and says, "Tell me what I am not seeing." These are small actions, but they have immense power. They protect you from becoming the kind of person who sounds certain while living inside confusion. They keep you from becoming a proud version of your own blind spots. And what matters here is that this process is not meant to make you timid. It is not meant to strip away your confidence until you become passive and afraid. The goal is not less strength. The goal is cleaner strength. Strength that does not depend on pretending to know what you do not know. Strength that can stay calm while being corrected. Strength that values truth more than appearance. By the end of this chapter, you should feel something very specific. More awake, more humble, but also more grounded. Because there is real power in no longer needing to be right all the time. There is real freedom in learning how to test yourself without attacking yourself. And once you begin to practice that kind of honest doubt, you do not become smaller, you become harder to fool, including by your own mind. Chapter 12, The Final Lesson. The most dangerous thing is not ignorance, but ignorance wrapped in absolute certainty. Ignorance by itself can still be corrected. A person cannot know something and still remain open. A person can be uninformed and still be teachable. A person can make mistakes and still change course. In that state, there is hope, because there is space. Space for truth, space for learning, space for reality to enter. But ignorance joined with pride is different. Ignorance wrapped in absolute certainty becomes resistant to every remedy. It stops listening. It stops questioning. It stops learning. And once that happens, the problem is no longer a lack of information. The problem becomes a hardened inner structure that treats correction as the enemy. That is the final danger this book has been moving toward all along. When a person is wrong and also convinced they cannot be wrong, they are no longer standing in front of knowledge with an open mind. They are standing behind a wall. And that wall is not made of logic. It is made of ego, habit, environment, false praise, emotional comfort, and the deep fear of being exposed as someone who does not know. Every chapter of this book has shown you one brick in that wall: shallow understanding, familiar words mistaken for real knowledge, stories invented too quickly to fill uncertainty, poor judgment about who is truly skilled, weak self-awareness, the instinct to protect pride, environments that reward distortion, language used to impress instead of clarify, early success turned into illusion, and the painful difficulty of staying intellectually humble. None of these things alone are the whole problem, but together they form a barrier that can keep a person trapped inside their own certainty for years. This is why we must return, at the end, to the story that opened the journey. MacArthur Wheeler did not fail merely because he lacked information. He failed because the false belief in his mind was stronger than his willingness to test it against reality. That is the detail that matters most. His mistake was not just ignorance, His mistake was confidence without correction, and that same tragedy repeats itself every day in much quieter forms. It happens at work when someone refuses feedback because they have already decided they are brilliant. It happens in families when a person clings to a harmful pattern because admitting error would wound their pride. It happens online when people spread judgment with total certainty after seeing only fragments of the truth. It happens privately inside your own thoughts, when you protect a conclusion because it feels safer than opening it up to examination. That is why this book is no longer about a few foolish people somewhere out there. It is about a permanent human risk. The risk of becoming too comfortable with your own certainty. The risk of loving the feeling of being right more than the practice of becoming right. The risk of confusing inner conviction with actual truth. If there is one final lesson to carry with you, let it be this. The greatest danger is not that you do not know. The greatest danger is that you do not know, and yet you treat your certainty as proof. Once that happens, learning begins to die. But the opposite is also true, and it is deeply hopeful. The moment you loosen your grip on the need to be unquestionably right, wisdom can begin to breathe again. The wall begins to crack. Light enters, and with that light comes a more honest, calmer, stronger mind. Not a mind that knows everything, but a mind that can still be reached by truth. That is the real victory. Not sounding intelligent, not appearing superior, but remaining open enough, brave enough, and humble enough to keep becoming wiser. This journey began with a question that seems ordinary on the surface, yet reaches into one of the deepest weaknesses of the human mind. Why do some people know so little, yet feel so certain that they are right? By now, you can see that the answer is not simply a matter of natural intelligence. It is not about who was born gifted and who was not. It is about something far more personal and far more important. It is about whether a person has learned to examine their own certainty. It is about whether they can pause, question themselves, and admit that the picture in their mind may be incomplete. Because the real danger was never ignorance alone. Ignorance can still be taught. Ignorance can still listen. Ignorance can still grow. The true danger begins when a person does not know, yet treats the feeling of certainty as proof that they do. That is the trap. That is the darkness. And that is the condition this book has tried to bring gently into the light. So let the central message stay with you in the simplest possible form. The most dangerous thing is not that you do not know. The most dangerous thing is that you do not know, and yet you trust your confidence more than truth. That is where growth stops. That is where pride begins to rule. And that is where the mind slowly becomes closed. But tomorrow, you can begin a different path with one small act. Choose one belief you currently feel very sure about. Then write down 3 questions. Where did I learn this? How might someone more skilled than me challenge it? If I were wrong, what would be the first sign? That small practice can change the way you think. It can make you calmer, clearer, and more honest. And step by step, it can lead you out of the dark comfort of confident ignorance and into the quiet strength of a wiser mind.